Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rose. I'm the head of the Department of Political Studies, and I wanted to welcome all of you to the fifth John Meisel Lecture on Contemporary Political Issues. I wanted to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. To acknowledge that territory is to recognize its longer history predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies here. It's also to acknowledge the territory's significance for the indigenous peoples who live and continue to live upon it and whose practice and spiritualities are tied to the land. So I wanted to give everyone a moment to reflect on that. And now I'd like to introduce Associate Dean Warren Mabey to offer welcoming remarks from the Faculty of Arts and Science.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see so many people out, and I really appreciate people taking time to come to listen to this talk. I wanted to bring you words of welcome from Queen's University and from the Faculty of Arts and Science. Again, we appreciate all the work that has gone into putting this event together. This is the fifth installment in the John Meisel Lecture in Contemporary Political Controversies, and there have been a long series of speakers now that have contributed to this series. I do want to say a big thank you to the Meisel family, Professor Meisel himself, and to all of the people who have supported this speaker series over the years. You know, we can't do these things, we can't have these events without that support, and it is hugely appreciated by all of us here at the university. To introduce the speaker and to move us forward today, I'm going to call Jonathan back to the podium. Welcome here, and thank you all for coming.
Great. Thanks, Warren. John Meisel, as we just mentioned, turned 100 years old this last week. And John isn't able to be with us physically, but he's certainly here in presence. I visited him earlier in the fall when he was 99. I wanted to say hello and I wanted to tell him about the lecture. And I found that same kind of intellectual, infectious enthusiasm that characterized all my relations with him was still there and on full display. I said, at that time he was 99, I said, John, you're 99 years old and you still have an amazing sense of humor. And he turned to me and he said, Jonathan, I have a great sense of humor because I'm 99. And I thought, he still has the ability to make a clever quip, apparently. So this lecture series, as was just mentioned by Warren, was established in 2017. And it's one of the most visible parts of John's legacy. As one of Canada's leading and influential political scientists, he wanted a forum for addressing controversial political issues facing policymakers, political scientists, but most importantly, the public. This is the fifth installment, and it has featured some of the country's brightest early career scholars sharing their thoughts on issues as diverse as race, Indigenous reconciliation, violence against women, and the failures of liberalism. I invite you to check out all of those talks. They're posted on the Political Studies website, as this one will be as well. So this year's talk continues that illustrious tradition, and the slideshow that you saw as we were taking our seats, I think gives you some idea of the incredible legacy that Professor Meisel left the discipline and the university. Any academic is successful if their research leaves an impact on the discipline. John Meisel took that one step further and pioneered a whole new part of the discipline in Canada, political behavior. He taught subsequent generations of scholars how to think about elections, political parties, cultural politics in Quebec. Much of the scholars in those fields owe a significant intellectual debt to Professor Meisel's thinking reflection, and writing. He was the founding editor of the International Political Science Review, and in doing so, he wanted to make sure the lessons of Canada's political culture and our governance were shared with colleagues around the world, and that our international colleagues could learn more about Canada. But more than pioneering a field of study, John was the quintessential public intellectual, which means, as John himself has written about his colleague Alan Cairns, quote, not simply to be committed to a professional or public or private domain, but to a public world and in a public language. John Meisel certainly did that in his writings, which were, as anyone who's read them know, accessible and crisp. He did that in his speech, which was refreshingly unadorned with academic jargon and clear. And he also reflected a very fine Queen's tradition of taking his expertise and sharing it with governments and policymakers. John Meisel was head of the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission at a time when the mass media were undergoing some significant technological changes. And our speaker today exemplifies the goals of this series. An engaged public intellectual has something important to say about critical issues faced by Canadians. It's a lovely, suitable 100th birthday present to John Meisel that Professor Dubois will speak to us about one of the most pressing communication challenges facing citizens: the rise of a new source of information and our collective inability to grapple with its significance. And I have to tell you, I'm really looking forward to telling John Meisel all about it. Dr. Elizabeth Dubois holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford and is an associate professor and university research chair in politics, communication, and technology at the University of Ottawa, where she runs the Paul Com Tech Lab and is a member of the Center of Law for Law, Society, and Technology. She's also a faculty associate and former fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, an affiliate at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. Her work examines political uses of digital media, including artificial intelligence, political social media influencers, the talk today, and online harassment of public figures. In 2019, she led the Digital Ecosystem Research Challenge, which brought together 18 research teams to examine uses of digital media in the 2019 federal election. Dr. Dubois collaborates internationally with nonprofits, technology companies, journalists, and academics, and hosts a really great podcast, I encourage you to check it out, called The Womps and War Rooms. And that's a place where political communication meets on-the-ground strategy. Her public writing has appeared in diverse places: Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Policy Options, Conversation, Salon, and has been featured in many other places. You can find her on Twitter, I refuse to use the new name, at Liz Dubois, or check out her latest book, Citizenship in a Connected Canada. So Dr. Dubois will speak for about 40 minutes, and after the talk, there's a microphone in the aisle. We'll open it up to questions. So please welcome to Queen's, Dr. Elizabeth Dubois.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that really wonderful introduction. It is an honor to be here for the John Meisel Lecture. And today I'm going to talk about social media influencers in politics and how we're really not ready for them. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about what's inspired my research program more broadly, the democratizing promise of the internet, which I think it's not a stretch to say none of us actually think is the case anymore. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what social media influencers actually are and what that looks like when they get political. I'm going to talk about the different kinds of political roles that social media influencers can play, and then we'll talk about who and who is not ready to deal with these new political actors. Early days there was this view that because the internet could be more accessible, it could help break down barriers of time and space, that more people were going to be able to be engaged in their political systems, and more people were going to participate, and everyone was going to get a voice, and democracy would be at its best. In the 2011 Arab Spring, we heard talk of social media's revolutionary power, and there was all of this conversation about how social media was leading to revolution. 10 years later, researchers have studied that revolution, that social media revolution, and they've found that while people were using it to mobilize and connect, social media companies were also limiting certain kinds of speech and certain kinds of organization. And we see that today. And not only do we see that today, but we also see today that these social media platforms are very powerful enablers of, as this author explains, disinformation campaigns, harassment, censorship, incitement of violence against activists, journalists, human rights advocates, and so on. We know that these platforms get used for a lot of different purposes. We know that social media is not necessarily democratizing. It's also not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily a disinformation, chaotic sphere. So in the context of a recognition that social media and the internet and related tools more broadly are not necessarily good nor bad, social media platforms have started to say, don't know if politics is the game I want to be in. Don't know if I want to be the place that has to decide what is and is not okay as political content, political speech. So Meta, when they announced their new tool Threads, which looks a lot like Twitter, they explicitly said, this isn't supposed to be a place for politics, this isn't supposed to be a place for news. They tried to spin it as like, users are gonna see what they want. In reality, they're still doing content moderation. They're still making choices about what gets prioritized and what doesn't. And the choices they're trying to make limit politics. The thing is, they're not very good at limiting politics, and social media are inevitably political spaces. So this graph is pulled from the Reuters Digital News Report, which is a project that has gone on for many years based at Oxford University. They do a cross-national study. This is the Canadian data that I'm showing you, and it shows you the third line down there. Social media is consistently a pretty large share of where people are getting news information in Canada. You're seeing in 2023, all of the sources of news go down. We're all a little bit tired of it, it seems. But still, we're over 45% of people getting some of their news from social media. But those platforms, being unavoidably political, are still trying to say, we're not in space for that, we're not encouraging it, even though people are still finding ways to share it. So in Canada recently, you may have noticed there was Bill C-18, and this was a new set of rules related to when platforms are allowed to share links to news content. And Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Threads, has decided, okay, just no news content. We're not gonna have to pay news providers for their content. We're just not gonna have any of those links. And as we're gonna see, social media influencers, among others, are finding ways to get around those rules to still talk about news. And all kinds of important issues in our daily lives get political when they are contested. So everything we do on social media can end up political. So, who are social media influencers? When I say social media influencer, most people tend to think of fairly young faces, people who are taking selfies, talking directly to a camera, and posting content online. You might think of social media marketing, which is an example here of Charlie on the left, who is partnering with a skincare brand to promote that product. Social media influencers can look like this, but they can also look like anyone else. And in fact, social media influencers do exist in a wide array of areas. On TikTok, there's book talk and corgi talk and hockey talk and D&D talk and all of the different hobbies and small niche communities you can imagine, they can exist there. And they exist across all kinds of other platforms as well. Okay, there we go. So when we're thinking about social media influencers, Brooke Aaron Duffy, who has been doing a lot of study into the influencer industry, has a great definition. She talks about this highly visible subset of digital content creators who are defined by their substantial following, their distinctive brand persona, and this patterned relationship they have with commercial entities. So I want to break this down for a minute. The idea of being a digital content creator, that suggests it's not just social media. And while I'm going to talk about social media today, I want you to know that influencers act on instant messaging apps. They act in non-social media contexts as well. Sometimes they have newsletters, for example, that go out via email. They often have Patreon accounts and Discords and a lot of other kinds of digital tools of communication. They create content across these different tools. They have a substantial following, but that idea of substantial, we're going to see, really is a matter of perspective, and how we define what counts as substantial is a really big problem when we're trying to think about the role of these actors. Their distinctive brand persona. This you might have heard of talked about as authenticity. Social media influencers, they create a brand, a persona, a view of who they are for their audiences. It may or may not actually link up to who they are in their personal life, but it is a consistent kind of knowable creation that they perform online. This patterned relationship with commercial sponsors. And this is where I think the idea of social media influencer broadly, when it meets political influencers, starts to have some issues. Because right now, influencer studies really is focused on the economic impacts and the way the industry is forming. But when we think about what motivates people to engage in politics, it's not always or only commercial motives. And so I think we're going to need to, as political scientists, dig into those different motives in a way that current influencer studies hasn't been doing. So, when we think about these influencers, marketing companies right now give us one categorization structure. And I'm going to offer later on a different kind of categorization structure, but it's helpful to know how they do it right now. So right now they say the best way to think about different kinds of influencers is to think about how big their following is. And we name them nano, micro, macro, and mega. Nano are these like really tiny influencers who maybe have 1,000 followers and a really tight-knit community. They might be similar to what we used to call opinion leaders. Back in media studies early days, we had this idea of a two-step flow of communication. We thought of these opinion leaders who could be just like us, but we happen to pay more attention to politics. And so our friends and family go to us to get political information. And then it goes all the way up to mega, which are these superstars, which basically look like celebrities. The problem with this categorization structure, of course, is that how do you determine what the threshold is between each of them? That threshold is likely to change based on what platform you're talking about. It's likely to change based on what language, cultural context, country, and all of those things matter a lot when we're talking about politics and political engagement. The influencer industry is getting very advanced. It is getting formalized. When the influencer industry started, it was actually a lot of people playing around with social media, figuring out how they could connect with others. But what we're seeing now is a formalized approach. This is an example of an analytics dashboard from an app called Tracker. This tool is used by influencers and by marketers and by commercial entities wanting to work with influencers to try and understand who a given influencer is likely to be able to access. The influencer industry is highly data-driven. What's more, the influencer industry is not just about influencers using social media, it's about influencers interacting with other important political actors. For example, influencers have formal partnerships with platforms. The YouTube creator program up here, they have a whole video about how to use YouTube to make you more money. And then an example over here from the US, TikTok, when it was lobbying Congress, hired lobbyists and popular influencers to Capitol Hill to have those political meetings and discussions. So, what's the appeal? Why are influencers so important? What is making them so popular? Why are we investing, by we I mean society, investing in this relationship? Well, what we see is that audience, the relationship to audience, and the platform knowledge are the key components here. On the audience side, influencers have this reach within their fan base that might not be accessible to a given brand or political party, right? The knitters of TikTok might be really motivated on particular policy issues in a way that you wouldn't expect the fantasy hockey folks of TikTok to be engaged, right? And so you can see how their connection and knowledge of their audience can be really, really valuable. It's kind of similar to micro-targeting. And if you'll remember with Cambridge Analytica and the ideas around micro-targeting, we as a society are pretty worried about the potential to send messages to certain parts of the population and not others. For political entities to be able to tell one group they are going to do one thing and another group the complete opposite, that would be a problem for our democracy. And so when we think about the value of influencers, there's also some risks. When it comes to the relationship to audiences, influencers are able to connect on a social and sometimes personal level. So those nano-influencers I talked about, they look a lot like opinion leaders applying social pressure and social support to their friends and family and other followers online. As their audiences grow, their connection to those folks changes. And so what we actually see is at a kind of micro or macro level, they might start using what's called parasocial relationships. There, the followers and fans, they think they're connected to the influencer, but actually the influencer has no idea who they are beyond them in an analytics dashboard. And then at the mega level, they start to use celebrity status. Lastly is this idea of platform knowledge. And this is the one that I think is most crucial when we're thinking about political campaigns. Influencers are experts in the platforms they use. Influencers know how to get around algorithmic prioritization and deprioritization. They know what the norms of a platform are. They know how to skirt rules, and they know when those rules are changing. And those rules, they change really fast. And the algorithms, they are black boxes. And so it's really difficult if you are not an expert in that platform to know how to get a message out. And it's no surprise that the average candidate isn't going to be an expert in all of the platforms. And so it's reasonable to think that influencers would be a really useful contribution to campaign tactics. Now, let's get into political influencers specifically. I'm going to run through a variety of examples of different kinds of political and news influencers, and then we're going to get to my categorization scheme that I think we need to be using. So, sometimes political influencers look like influencers who picked a brand persona related to politics. So this is an example from the US where this pair, Diamond and Silk, they created their Facebook page specifically to talk about politics. They became known go-to political commentators without being formal TV commentators about politics. Then we have influencers whose brand persona has nothing to do with politics, but they sometimes get political. So this is a Canadian Twitch streamer who's also on a bunch of other platforms. She plays live video games, streams them on Twitch, and she has played games with AOC, a representative in the States, as well as Jagmeet Singh. Of course, we have political or politicians rather, who themselves start using influencer tactics, right? We can see these two examples of young politicians who are engaging. Usually we think about this as politicians trying to connect with the youth because youth are the ones that we connect with via technology, which is not necessarily fair, but it's nevertheless the strategy that gets used. Oh, we're having some clicker trouble, I'm sorry. All right, there we go. Then we have examples of political actors who started out as influencers. So this is an example of a Brazilian House of Representatives member and pre-candidate for mayor of Sao Paulo. He actually got his start as a YouTuber back in 2014, 2015, built a whole movement that led to the coup in 2018 of the president in Brazil, and became an elected member of the House of Representatives. He actually continues his YouTuber influencer approach. This account on the far side here, Kata Games, is his YouTube account specifically dedicated to live streaming him playing video games while he is an elected politician. Not to promote his political ideas, but because that's the thing that he does, as well as being a politician. Then we have news influencers. And news influencers, I think, particularly in the last few weeks, as we've seen the Israel-Hamas war break out and the kind of information coming across our feeds really shift and change in the context of a crisis situation, these news influencers have become really important players. So we have news influencers that don't consider themselves news at all, right? So there's somebody like Decolonize Myself, who is a Two-Spirit Cree First Nations personal journey, exploring colonization, decolonization, healing, and culture, right? That's what his Twitter, or their Twitter rather, says on their feed. They take screenshots of different news articles, among posting other kinds of things, but they post these screenshots, sometimes adding commentary, sometimes just saying, hey, pay attention to this. This is news information that I think my followers should see. So they're not a journalist, they're not even a citizen journalist trying to do their own reporting, but what they are doing is translating information, curating information, sharing it with their group. In contrast, we have accounts which are, this clicker is really not my friend today, I'm sorry. Okay, hopefully we'll stay here for a second. Then we have accounts like Dylan Page, who is the self-proclaimed news daddy of TikTok. What he does is he reports on the kinds of things that he thinks are important happening in current affairs and news. He's curating information for a group of people who have chosen to pay attention to his kind of content. He's not a trained journalist, and he's not trying to be a trained journalist, but he is talking about himself as being a news delivery agent, right? On the other side, there's This Explained, and they explicitly state in their bio there, we're not news. We're a community-based Canadian digital project that aims to explain how, where, and when things are happening. But when you go and look at their content, a lot of it seems pretty newsy. The thing is, it's newsy with a particular political perspective, and so that becomes more activist-y. It's a melding of the two. And then, of course, we have trained journalists, people who have worked in newsrooms, maybe even continue to work in newsrooms, who are using these platforms and using the styles and techniques of these platforms, who are gaining that platform-specific knowledge. And so they look a lot like influencers. Rachel Gilmore is a Canadian example of that. So, influencers are having a wide variety of different impacts on our political systems. We have influencers that are used to get out the vote and encourage engagement, but we also have influencers that can share myths or disinformation, particularly in crisis situations where you have folks who are not trained journalists. You might end up having content come across feeds that hasn't been verified yet, that is emotional and feels true, but maybe even isn't. A role of influencers holding journalism to account, saying, hey, the journalists aren't doing a good enough job, that's why I'm doing this. That creates a very messy information environment. And so what I argue is we actually need to understand who these folks are a lot better if we're going to be able to develop media and digital literacy skills that are appropriate for this information environment, if we're going to be able to identify the kinds of regulatory approaches that are needed, if platforms are going to be able to help foster a positive information environment for us to participate in. I want to give you 2 examples that are a little bit murky. If the slide will switch. Nope. There we go. So, Amy is a nail art influencer. Her whole thing is creating really intricate, cool, detailed fake nails, and she does a little video of how she's making them and putting them on, and then she sends it off. TikTok is her main place. She has a particularly strong connection with Asian American TikTok users and understands her community as being an Asian American community who are interested in nail art. Ahead of the 2022 midterm elections in the US, she made this video, and this is a few clips of that video where her nails are actually talking about how many voters there are among Asian American Pacific Islanders and how if we all go vote, we could sway this election. It's super important. Go register to vote, participate in the elections. This seems like a really good thing for democracy, right? Like we want more people to participate. But what's not clear from her video is that she was actually paid by a nonprofit in the US who was specifically working on getting out the vote of that demographic. Again, paying to have somebody do a get out the vote message is not necessarily problematic. I think the problematic part is that we don't know that that's happening. And when we think about information in our media environment, a lot of the time we have stuff show up on our screens and we don't know why it's there. The #1 lesson in digital and media literacy right now is figure out why the information's on your screen. So I think this is a murky example because we don't actually have the information we need to evaluate it. Then we have examples of micro-influencers. Now, micro-influencers are relatively inexpensive to hire, so this makes them accessible to smaller campaigns. They have really tight-knit relationships with their audiences and communities, which makes them potentially very influential and can deliver information and mobilize people in a way that a campaign on its own wouldn't be able to do. All really positive. However, they're being hired to intentionally skirt advertising spending limits and advertising transparency registries. They are being hired to send disinformation. And because they're a really small fish in a very big pond, even when they do explicitly break rules and laws, they're rarely tracked down because the cost of enforcing those rules is just way too high to make it worthwhile. But when you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of them working in an election context, that becomes a potential problem. Now we get to my categorization. What I've said so far is that we've got all of these different influencers. They're super important. They could be really good or problematic in our politics. And the measurement of them based on their follower size isn't enough. What I think we need to do is really critically think about the kinds of roles they're playing in our elections and our politics more broadly, and then think about how we want to understand them, and potentially regulate them based on those roles, rather than if they're really big, then we pay attention to them, and if they're really small, we ignore them. So the first kind of role that an influencer can play is that of a celebrity. When an influencer is popular enough, big enough, famous enough, they start to look a lot like celebrities. And we do understand that celebrities have a role to play in politics. We all pay attention when Taylor Swift says, go register to vote. Like, she literally broke the registration system the first time she put out on her social media that she wanted people to go register to vote. It crashed, they had to fix it because so many people swarmed the site. That's great. When influencers do that and they want to have what is essentially just some free publicity, fine. When celebrities go to campaign events, there are rules about whether or not the campaign is allowed to pay for their hotel or give them an honorarium for attending. And I think that there are some ways that we can think about particular kinds of influencers like celebrities and then just apply the existing rules. The thing is, of course, that in other instances, they play different kinds of roles. Like advertisers. Social media advertising is an industry. It is established, and we are starting to see dozens of different firms pop up specifically to be the middleman between campaigns and influencers. In those cases, it makes sense to apply election advertising rules and consumer protection rules about advertising done by these influencers. It makes sense that we would track them in the same way. But that gets complicated when we then think about campaign volunteers. Door knocking, phone banking, having a backyard barbecue, these are all ways that people show support for political parties that they care about and activist organizations that they care about. In the context of COVID, this thing called relational organizing or relational campaigning started to get more popular. And what we saw was these campaigns were saying, hey, volunteers, can you send out this specific message that we've pre-written for you? Can you send it out to your Facebook friends and your email list and your text message list? Now, what happens if you happen to have a campaign volunteer who has a really large following on Facebook? Did you just ask for an in-kind donation? Because if you had have asked them specifically through an advertising mechanism for it, then either you'd have to pay them for this and it would be spending, or it's an in-kind donation. But what does that look like when we're talking about people just chatting about politics? We could see people who aren't even volunteering for a campaign talking about politics, trying to engage. We want that in our society, but actually they end up in this really murky territory where sometimes they get paid for their speech online and sometimes they don't. And we need to be able to figure out when we are thinking about it as an average person talking, a volunteer being fed coordinated lines, or somebody being paid. I've already talked a little bit about those news influencers and the role of journalists here. What's important to know is that journalists and other political actors, they are already treated differently in our electoral laws for good reason. Journalists play a really important part in holding government to account, making sure that we understand what's happening in our society in order to make informed political choices. And so we would want people who are performing that journalistic role as social media influencers to still be able to do that without being silenced or chilled. And lastly, they could play the role of data broker. Data is the game here, right? Like, a lot of social media influencers, we think about the content first, but the reality is they are valuable because they know so much about their audiences and they can target those audiences. At the same time, political parties in Canada, unless you're in British Columbia, are not subject to privacy laws. So that means that influencers, who often are in very small businesses, like business of one, and might not understand how they are implicated in privacy laws, could be sharing information with parties. It goes into the political party database, which no longer gets applied, is no longer applied under the privacy laws. And then we end up with people's personal data being used in ways they never imagined it would be and never consented to. So, I think we need to be thinking about political influencers not based on the size of their following, but instead based on their roles. The roles that I've outlined here are still pretty theoretical. We need a lot more research into the actual ways that influencers are acting in our political systems if we're going to be able to create good approaches to respond. So the next thing that I did was try and figure out, okay, well, how are we doing so far? I looked at the existing laws, guidelines, regulations, policies, everything I could find at the federal, state, provincial, and territorial level in Canada and the US. And we're about to expand this to a number of other countries. And what we found is that there are very, very, very few pieces of legislation, very few guidelines, very few things that specify anything about political social media influencers. The few things we did find fall into two camps. We have the consumer protection camp, and this is the stuff that applies all of the time. This includes things like endorsements and disclosure of payment. Then we have the elections laws camp, which only apply during election times, or in Canada we have our pre-election period. This focuses on payment as well. It focuses specifically on advertising and spending limits. Both of these approaches uniquely see influencers as advertisers. These approaches do not consider the other kinds of roles that influencers could play. So immediately, we already have a problem with the influencers who are journalists, because we know one part of election laws say journalists are exempt from spending limits, and another part say advertisers need to be included. So we have a problem. And we need to dig through that, preferably ahead of the next election. The other thing that I want to talk about here is that focus on payment. Right now, most of our understanding of influencers is a follow the money approach. Most of the time when we're thinking about political influencers, we're trying to track who paid how much to who. And if we can map that out, then we can create a case saying this group was paid and it shouldn't have been because it wasn't reported. The thing is, influencers often are paid through non-monetary approaches, and influencers are often involved in coordination efforts without payment. So on the non-monetary front, things like inviting influencers to a conference, putting them in a room together, giving them opportunities for collaborations, which is really valuable to influencers in order to build out wider audiences, wider follower base. Those people just got a whole lot of value out of going to that event. They maybe were never paid to do it. Their flight was covered, okay, fine. They're given this opportunity to connect with collaborators, probably not monitored at all. Then when you think about the way that influencers can be coordinated, they're at those kinds of events, and then they get given different kinds of talking points. What we would understand is talking points, but what they might understand is just like information at a cool panel that they went to. And then they're not required, but they're encouraged to share that information with their followers and fans. This happens regularly, particularly in the US. There are multiple different organizations which are designed specifically to bring progressive influencers together to help them connect, to help them find folks that they want to connect with and share content with and collaborate with. And all of that might be legitimate, great campaign strategy, right? That's an innovative piece of technology that we don't necessarily want to stifle. The problem is that sort of coordination can start to look really different when it's applied for disinformation campaigns, or when it's applied in contexts where it's getting people together that have anti-democratic aims, right? So there's murky territory to go through. What about the platforms? Are they ready? No. Not only are the platforms not ready, but they are less ready than they used to be. So platforms, over the last few months, have been laying off in masses their trust and safety teams. The trust and safety teams are the teams that are responsible for ensuring that community standards are being followed. So those rules that say you're not allowed to put hate speech on our platform, it's the trust and safety team that makes sure that hate speech doesn't actually show up on the platform. And so as these platforms are saying, you want to be less political, or we don't care how political you are, say whatever you want, both of those approaches are basically we don't want to be responsible. So they're cutting out who's going to be involved in making sure that that is happening in a way that is safe or in accordance with their community standards, if not safe. And then you have things like Elon Musk making a post about, hey, here's some great posts to follow for up-to-date information about the war. And it turns out that they were anti-Semitic accounts sharing disinformation. And so you have to delete the tweet. Facebook stands up this great team cracking down on violent content. The reason they had to suddenly stand up the team is because they laid everyone off a few months ago. They suddenly needed to stand up a team, which means that that team was necessarily behind aim. They weren't proactively trying to figure out what was happening. And in this information environment, influencers are playing a huge, really important role. These influencers and particular accounts are being identified as reliable sources of information, but we don't actually know that they're reliable. And then what about the rest of us? What about educators and journalists and civil society groups and the general public? Well, without the knowledge that the platforms that we're relying on or the governments that we expect to keep public safety as the priority, despite them not knowing, we are kind of left to deal. And I don't think we're in a good position yet. I think our media and digital literacy strategies that we currently have don't account for this environment where influencers play all of these different kinds of roles, where we're not yet good at identifying which role which ones are playing, where they all kind of look the same but also drastically different. So, how do we get ready? What do we do? I think the first thing is we need better definitions of who counts as an influencer and what kinds of influencers there are. I am suggesting we take this roles-based approach and we think of different kinds of influencers based on the roles they're playing. And we recognize that a given account could play multiple roles at different times and they could be overlapping. But I think by giving those kinds of names to the accounts, that'll help us think more critically about whether or not we think they're playing those roles well, whether or not we think they're playing those roles appropriately. I think if we can start naming these accounts for the kinds of activities they're doing in our political system, we're going to get better at evaluating for ourselves whether or not it is an appropriate contribution to our system and whether it's something that we want to pay attention to or we want to unfollow. Next, I think we need to start developing tools to hold these kinds of accounts accountable. Just like we have systems that help hold politicians to account and help hold journalists to account. Yes, sometimes they fail, but in theory the systems exist. We need to be thinking about how to hold influencers to account. Because right now, we don't have good systems for that because they're such new actors. And lastly, I think we're going to need to reevaluate some of our core lessons in media and digital literacy. For example, one of the key things that I and a number of other people have been saying for years is if it gives you a strong emotion, you need to question it. If something comes across your feed and you're like, oh my gosh, how horrible, you need to wonder. Because the algorithms that underpin our platforms are targeted towards reinforcing things that are sensational, that are exciting, that are surprising, that are shocking, because those are the things that get liked and reshared and commented on. But influencers bring emotion into everything. That's kind of their job. That's kind of part of that authenticity. That's kind of part of what it is to be an influencer. Influencers need to portray this kind of human connection. That's the way that they develop relationships with their friends and followers and fans. And that's what makes them valuable as information delivery agents, right? So when the very tactic that makes them popular is the same tactic we need to use to try and discredit, we have a problem. I'm not saying don't question things that are emotional that come across your screen anymore. I'm saying don't assume that if an influencer says it, even though it's emotional, it's fine because it's an influencer you trust. That influencer might not have done the job of checking up on that information either. So at this point, I have probably offered a lot of scary views of what social media influencers can be in politics, but I want to reiterate that there's a lot of potential value here too. There's a lot of potential for influencers to be integrated into campaign strategies and into our political information environments in a really helpful way. We know from years of study at this point that people connect with other people. And so influencers offer this personal connection in a way that can be really empowering. I am going to be doing a new season of the podcast that Jonathan mentioned earlier, along with War Rooms. In January, we're starting a season on the idea of personal influence and how that has shifted from the days of opinion leaders in the 50s when Katz and Lazarsfeld first came up with that theory, all the way up to generative AI and how that changes what it means to be personally influenced. So, if you've enjoyed listening to my voice today, you might check out the podcast. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts, and we'll be continuing this conversation there throughout the term. And finally, if you would like to follow up on any of the things that I've talked about today, or want to learn more about the Qualcomm Tech Lab and the variety of different kinds of research we do there, you can find us at qualcommtech.com, Qualcomm Tech on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and you can also always reach out to me directly. Thanks so much.